Hello, and welcome to this lecture on immigration and migration in Europe following World War II. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how immigration and migration has played a significant role in European affairs in the decades following World War II. After World War II, going back to it, we're going to see large numbers of migrants and immigrants come into Europe to help rebuild the continent. Just as much of Europe was destroyed in World War II, we're going to see people within Europe and from outside Europe move into Europe to help rebuild. One such famous program was Germany's West Guest Worker Program, which allowed people from around the continent, particularly from Spain and Portugal, to come into West Germany to help rebuild the destroyed nation. These countries were able to fund this through private enterprises and through banking systems, but also importantly because of the Marshall Plan that was provided by America. That provided some funds for these guest workers to be paid and to be brought into these nations so that they could work and rebuild. My grandfather in Portugal, for example, he was a guest worker. He traveled to West Germany and he worked to help rebuild parts of that nation. Most of these guest workers were young single men. They were unskilled workers, so they worked for low wages, and they sent money back home. Some stayed in their new country. They gained citizenship one way or another and were able to stay, but many returned home. We didn't see a lot of acceptance of these guest workers across the board, and they faced some forms of discrimination. In Britain, for example, we see severe acts of discrimination across Britain. We see large numbers of migrants from Britain's still existent at the time colonial empire traveling into Britain to help rebuild the nation after World War II. We see migrants from India, Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean moving into Britain after Britain passed a Nationality Act of 1948, giving colonial citizens a right to settle in the United Kingdom and become UK citizens. However, we see large amounts of discrimination against these groups. The migrants from the Caribbean, they were called the Windrush generation. They migrated into Britain and helped rebuild the nation, but they faced large amounts of discrimination because many of them were black. And, Britain had its issues with racism, still does to this day. So we see large amounts of discrimination against these groups, which still unfortunately exists to an extent today. France passes a similar act, allowing people living in Algeria, Cameroon, and the Ivory Coast to move to France to become citizens. Indonesians from the Netherlands are allowed to migrate to the Netherlands as well. So while this immigrant labor did help fuel the recovery of Europe, this does create a more diverse continent for the first time. We're seeing Europe become less white as the years go on, which stokes fears of racism and racist retaliation. This leads to discrimination. We see housing discrimination, anti-immigrant riots, for example, the Notting Hill riots, in which you see large amounts of white English people beating up and attacking black English people and accusing them of acts and things like that. So this occurs not just in England, but across the continent, wherever you see guest workers and people travel and move to in the years following World War II. Looking at Europe today, we're still seeing migration and movement. Europe does have a demographic crisis. Basically, we see very low birth rates across the continent. You need to have a natural birth rate of over 2.1 kids. So you don't have a growing population unless you have 2.1 kids per family on average. Europe's ranges of reproduction range from 1.2 to 1.8, which means that their population is shrinking. Really, the only way for this to kind of improve is for either Europeans to have more babies, and despite some conservative nations trying, it is not working, or to change migration and move migration around. If this doesn't change, we see a demographic ticking time bomb because you'll have more people on social welfare systems taking security, retirement, and spending more and more in their healthcare system, and less people paying into those systems, leading to demographic collapse and countries to kind of fall apart. Right-wing nations such as Hungary have implemented neonatalist practices, again, trying to incentivize families to have more kids by giving them money, tax breaks, benefits, etc. But even that is not enough to fix the problem. It's not really been shown to have an effect up until this point. America is having a similar problem, but America, up until recently at least, has allowed a decent amounts of migration into the nation. That being said, America is getting more and more restrictive with its immigration policies, which means America will eventually face a similar issue. Looking into migration and immigration in the 21st century, this has been a big point of contention and a big point of debate across the continent. As the Cold War ended, we do see movements across Europe become very common, particularly when we saw the Yugoslavian civil wars. We see large amounts of movement across the continent away from that conflict. When we see conflict in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, we see migrants moving from those regions into Europe. When America invaded Iraq, Afghanistan, and played a part in Libya and Syria's civil war, we see movements from those areas as well. The areas of Europe that are the hardest hit are the kind of border states, the European border states that are the closest to these war zones. Greece, Spain, Italy, Turkey are all points of contention and points for immigration. When this happens, we see millions of people flee into Europe. For example, we see 2.3 million people flee Syria and Iraq in 2015 and 2016, moving into different parts of the country. This has caused these border states, again, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Turkey, to become more conservative and to become highly against this migration and these movements. Banning laws, creating laws that has prevented the movement of these people. So what we see in this period in the 2010s is a response by the EU, led by Germany, Angela Merkel. They come together, and some nations decided to put their hands in and kind of help with this migrant process. Germany, for example, being one of the wealthiest nations in the EU, they promised homes for 800,000 migrants and encouraged their neighbors to do a similar take on a similar burden to support these people. Germany did have a compassionate stance, and they said, we're going to take in these people, help them out, and help rehabilitate them. Germany saw that this was a continent-wide problem that was caused in part by Europe's dominance of these regions and influence in these regions. So Europe had a role to play to assist these people in need. Because again, these are people fleeing war, violence, famine, death, and destruction. So it's only right for these rich nations to welcome these people in and to support one another. And as I've said, going back to this slide here, you see that these countries have declining birth rates. They need more people to support their systems. So it only makes sense to allow people in to fill these gaps that you see in these nations. However, we do see some tragedies. People fleeing from Africa and the Middle East have not always made it safely landed on these shores. By sneaking in, we see people drown at sea, get lost at sea. We see people trapped in train cars, for example. There was a tragedy in which 71 dead migrants were found in a locked train car in Hungary due to some mistake or some foul play or something like that. With some nations such as Hungary, Austria, and some other neighboring nations not really taking in too many migrants. So again, it's been a mixed bag. The migration movement has teetered off a bit, but it is still a hot topic, and arguably it has led to the rise of the right wing inside Europe. The right wing, the new fascists you see in Europe, have really risen to power because they've used the migrant crisis, the migrant migration crisis, as a tool to say, look how these politicians are letting in all these migrants. We need to put a stop to this and make Europe for Europeans again and limit migration of people from outside Europe. It's obvious why Europe is chosen by these groups. Again, Germans and Polish people and Austrians and French people earn much more than the wages you'd find outside of Europe. It's much more safer, and it's a lot easier to live in the EU and in Europe rather than other places. Plus, Europe is connected to Asia and Africa, so it's not too difficult to get from these areas. So it has been a mixed bag with tragedy and some successes. But it hasn't as been a big of an issue in recent years due to the rise of the right wing and their limiting of migration. Multiculturalism, therefore, has been a big development in Europe in the past few years. We see again racism and discrimination in the continent against these different groups. We also see some celebrations of these different previously non-European beliefs. In England, for example, we do see some many migrants coming from India, immigrating to India and becoming a core piece of the nation. India had a leg up because English was a widely taught language in India and still is to this day. So moving to England doesn't create much of a barrier. You can move into the country and you can easily learn in schools and be connected to the rest of the country because you share that common language. That's not always the case, though. Migrants do have a big hurdle to climb when it comes to learning these different languages, but due to colonialism, that isn't always the case. Also, with Britain, Britain's national dish is chicken tikka masala, which is based on Indian cuisine, Indian spices. So again, you do see these countries improve and become more multicultural, improving the lives of Europeans, improving the cuisine of these Europeans. In Portugal, for example, you see peri peri chicken from Africa, one of the most popular dishes in the nation. In Germany, for example, you see the doner kebab from Turkey and from other parts of the Middle East. That has become a big part of the continent. So Europeans that are against migration and immigration tend to like some of the traditional classic things, but overlook some of the positives and all the good things that kind of come with migration. One big change has been the increase in Islam in the continent. Islam is now the largest minority religion in Europe. We see Muslims outnumbering Catholics in Protestant Northern Europe and outnumber Protestants in Catholic Southern Europe. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger religion and more an important part of European culture. Again, that comes with discrimination. Again, as we've talked about in this class, Europeans have been very intolerant, if not violent, against Muslims across the generations, across the centuries, but that is changing. However, we do see attacks by Islamic extremists from the Middle East, from Northern Africa, that attacked Spain in 2004, London in 2005, and Paris in 2015, and then in different parts in Paris in that year, leading to the deaths of Europeans. When these happen, they happen and they cause massive amounts of backlash and anti-Islamic beliefs and anti-Muslim behavior. The vast majority of Muslims in Europe and around the world support Europeans and democracy, but the few that don't, critics latch onto these anti-European Muslim beliefs and try to paint a whole picture as all Muslims being against Europeans, and try to accuse all Muslims of being representative of these of the attacks and violence, which is just not true. But critics and right-wing people will do that often to try to get their ways passed, and unfortunately, it is successful. So we do see these difficulties with multiculturalism, with anti-Muslim behavior and beliefs, causing more and more problems. But as time goes on, as these cultures cooperate and mix with each other, we do see these incidents kind of die down, fortunately. Unfortunately, though, we do see these rise up here and there. In 2024, in the summer, this past summer, we have seen riots break out. Just to show you how, people will riot over things they don't necessarily believe in, especially when it comes to, racist riots or discriminatory riots. We see right-wingers in England, in the UK, attack businesses, mosques, and housing after a UK resident stabbed 3 girls. The UK resident happened to follow Islam, or at least was a part of that community. And the people that saw this attack took it as a wide, saw that all Muslims and all people from that part of town were a part of this wave of violence. So we see this pogrom, more or less, this modern day pogrom against Muslims in England, attacking and protesting and trying to attack different buildings and parts of the city. This happened for a few days, and again, these people were rioting not just against Islam, but the fact that they believe this guy that did this violent, horrible act was a migrant, was a person who traveled into England when the person was born there. They were a UK resident. They lived there. They had citizenship there. So we again, there's this underlying current of racism, discrimination in England. Again, for the most part, over the years, it has gotten better and more relaxed, but we do see violence and discrimination spring up across the continent time and time again. All right, that is it for this lecture. Thanks for listening.